Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our fifth in the series of 6 webinars on the topic of NERC CIP in the cloud. As I'm really excited for this fifth webcast, primarily because we have an amazing speaker for you, but more than anything, because we only have one left. So I'm anxious to get to number 6 so we can start thinking about where we go from here as we've walked through kind of key topics that we believe are of the highest interest in this first set of 6 webcasts. There are a number of things that have been brought up throughout these 6 webcasts on what about this or what about that, and we've started building a secondary list of we should also do a webcast on this, on this, on this. So I highly anticipate another series that will follow this. Hopefully we can condense it down to maybe 2 or 3 really high impact webcasts that follow, but these first 6 have really tried to tackle kind of all the different perspectives that are out there. This one, being the 5th, is going to be more of a focus on some of the challenges that our sector is facing, the electric sector specifically with NERC CIP and cloud integration. However, as we've said in all 6 of these, some of the things that we will be talking about are specific to the regulatory challenges, and some of them are more specific to what portions of critical infrastructure or essential operations are people looking to push to the cloud and in what ways. So before we dive into this, let me introduce the 2 floating heads that you see on this slide. My name is Tim Conway. I am the Industrial Control System Curriculum Lead here at the SANS Institute. And my speaker today that has joined us, Tobias Whitney. For those of you who have been working in this sector for any period of time, you should be very familiar with this name, because Tobias has been a leading voice in the electric power industry, moving across a number of different domains from cybersecurity, regulatory compliance, and going back 10, 12 years, I can remember sitting sort of in the NERC CIP meetings, kind of the quarterly meetings that the CIP committees would gather, and hearing Tobias sort of lead the way on, from a NERC perspective and from a regulatory perspective and from an entity operations perspective, what should we be leaning into and pursuing and preparing for on topics like virtualization and cloud integration and newer technologies and managed services, in really trying to meet these things before they became a very large challenge for industry. So he's been working across these different domains for over 25 years. And from a personal perspective, I think early in those 25 years, I remember when he was with an organization doing work out with utilities, and coming from a utility myself for 16 years, being in working rooms and project planning with Tobias and the company that he was with and his team at the time, as CIP was just starting to be introduced into industry across our generating stations and field substation environments. So long history with Tobias, and Tobias has an extremely long history with the electric sector, helping shape standards and practices that protect the security and resilience of the electric grid, and kind of his innovative work that is bridged between traditional IT, OT, and sort of this compliance triangle has really sort of moved him down this career where many on this call, many in this sector are very familiar with Tobias in one way or another. And while he's been talking about this topic of cloud and NERC CIP for over a decade, he has moved into a role where this is really what he's focusing on now with a company that he's developed and created and founded, and continuing to stay in some of these sectors where he's looking at key standards, supply chain, distributed energy management, all the things that he's done in the past with third party, but now also looking at taking this company, Cumulus, and looking at a compliance platform that can enhance information sharing and operations with everything that he's sort of been involved in throughout his career. Let me move on for a moment, just to where we are coming from. While I've introduced myself as working for SANS, and I've introduced Tobias, I want to be clear that this effort, as we have highlighted in all 5 of these webcasts, we will continue to do so. This is an effort that is a coalition of the willing across a variety of different perspectives. So certainly from compliance across NERC and the regions, and certainly from an asset owner and an entity perspective, but as well from vendors and original equipment manufacturers and cybersecurity specialists, as well as training organizations and consultancies, looking to this emerging problem of solutions and a need to move things to the cloud that are going to be impactful to asset owners throughout North America, working within the NERC CIP standards, and impact them in different ways. So this group, you will also notice in your list of panelers, there's another name floating over there. He doesn't have a defined speaking role today, but we have the founder of the CTAG group, Lou Folkers, joined. So if you have questions specifically about this group, certainly submit them in the Q&A, and we will try to get those answered. But Lou saw these problems kind of facing the industry and created this Cloud Technology Advisory Group, the CTAG group. And that is really who, as we looked at this webcast series of 6, we worked across the CTAG group and said, what should these webcasts and what should this webinar cover? What should the first one cover, the second, the third? What are the key things that we need to address? And that's what formed this and shaped it. And then we looked to that CTAG group to say, who can best address some of these topics? When do we need to hear the voice of kind of NERC in the regions? When do we need to hear the voice of the entities? When should we hear from the solution providers, the software providers, and the applications set? And when should we hear from the cloud service providers and consultants and other people working in this space to talk about what these challenges are and what a regulatory path might be? And then when do we gather it all back together and hear from the individual regions about what they're seeing and what is the path forward? And that is what has been shaped. This isn't SANS. This isn't Reliability First or CERC or Cumulus or AWS. This is us working as the CTAG and kind of delivering a voice from the CTAG representative of the work that's happening there. This is something that is unique to the electric sector, as working in this space for about 27 years now, 28 years. You see when storms hit and we send mutual aid out and crews and trucks going to help others. We do the same thing when it comes to operations, from operational working groups and joint working groups. That has been that way for over 60 years. And as digitalization and industrial control systems and operational technology started to blend into this space, it was still in our DNA and how we shared information to best defend our systems. And then when we started to layer in requirements and standards, again, it's still in the DNA of this sector to help each other. One team, one mission approach. And the CTAG is a continuing example of that happening moving forward. Any questions on the CTAG? You have the CTAG founder here, so please submit your questions through the Q&A, and I will give Lou first right of refusal in responding to any CTAG related questions. As we pull together some of this, just again, we have a tremendous amount of people that will be pursuing these through the recorded sessions where these six-pack webinar series is held. And a number of people, we have the obvious attendees of interest that are registered entities in North America facing NERC CIP standards right now, and they have some part that they are interested in moving to cloud integration. Or they have a reality of, we use this software provider and they are no longer supporting on-prem solutions. So we need to either understand how we can comply with them in the cloud or look for alternatives. And in some cases, it may be an asset owner and operator that is building their first kind of low impact renewable energy asset base within the United States. And this may be their first introduction to CIP. And the last piece that I would want to sort of remind everybody of is the types of challenges that we're facing from a technical perspective and from a security perspective and reliability and resilience. That's not unique to just the electric sector. That's something for consideration for water facilities, for natural gas operators, for manufacturing plants. So a lot of the technical components that we're talking about and the security risks and reliability and resilience, those are the same product vendors and original equipment manufacturers and the same types of concerns facing the electric sector that are facing all of critical infrastructure. The things that we get into that are unique about NERC CIP, that may be very unique to NERC CIP, but you also may have your own requirements and standards and guidelines, depending on what country you're in, where you're going to start to see this as well. So we will generally talk as if we're talking to the primary audience of the electric sector, asset owners and operators throughout North America, but we understand cloud industrial integration is an area of concern for all sectors and all countries. The next piece that we will try to address here, and I know Tobias has another slide on this again where he refines this a little bit, but this model that was released some years ago, when people start talking about cloud, this model has sort of been provided to say, what specifically do you mean? Are you talking more towards these are the things that you traditionally manage under traditional IT? Are you looking towards infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service? So when you say cloud, what does that look like for you in regards to what you own and manage the responsibilities for versus someone else? And where is the data and what is the state of the data, depending on what part of this you are looking to pursue? So again, I will spend very little time here, as you will see a modified version of this slide when Tobias takes over here. The last piece that I will sort of cover here that has been sort of in the DNA of all 6 of these webinars is the cloud industrial integration is a thing that really drove kind of the CTAG. Then moving towards, when you say cloud, what do you mean, from the last slide that I just covered, to this, which is when you're talking about CIP in the cloud, what specifically are we talking about? Are we talking about BES cyber system information in the cloud? So data. And then is it data that's just there for storage? Is it data that's there in use from a software as a service? So is it a data element that is important from a NERC CIP perspective to ensure that you're protecting who has access to that, unauthorized access that could potentially lead to some type of incident? So the data piece. Or are we talking about how you're integrating this into sort of your system planning and your modeling and some key critical functions where you're using applications and you're using software as a service, and it's how you're doing your work? Or are we talking about moving all the way over where you're actually using cloud integration for some level of control from a real-time perspective? So when we're saying CIP in the cloud, number one, what are you calling cloud? Number two, what are you calling CIP? And really sort of defining those things can help shape a conversation that is far more meaningful and nuanced. And we have taken our best effort to really kind of start each of the 4 webcasts, and including this one now at the 5th, setting the stage to sort of make sure everyone is dialing in what they are talking about and what they're currently looking at moving towards. So depending on what part of the sector you're in, what types of assets you own and operate, what you're looking at doing and how you're looking at doing it may differ greatly from some other organization. So with that, I believe we are ready to turn over to Tobias. I'm going to move to this slide. And Tobias, originally, if you just want to give me the next slide whenever you're ready, but I will try to keep pace with you. In the meantime, I'm going to mute and turn it over to you.
Okay, Tim, thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate that intro. Thanks to the SANS team as well as the CTAG team, who's volunteered to take on this very challenging subject, which is cloud-based CIP applicable assets. So I really appreciate that. So this issue is really not new, obviously, but it's new to the electric power sector. But from a regulatory perspective, I know personally that we've been trying to address this issue well over 10 to 12 years now. While we've had some challenges articulating the risk and identifying the cybersecurity issues, we've certainly had challenges in understanding how does the reliability standards, specifically how do the CIP standards apply to cloud-based operations. So we're going to spend a lot of time in my discussion with you really breaking down into nuance, detail about the various types of CIP applicable assets and how we can ultimately address well, one, identifying the challenges, but two, how we can address potentially moving different bits and pieces of the SIP construct into a cloud environment. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, there's asset owners that are utilizing various types of newer, cleaner, greener, if you will, types of technologies, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We're seeing a new advent of newer technologies being addressed in the sector. But as we move towards recognizing the capabilities that are going to be leveraged in the cloud, we fully recognize that the cloud service providers aren't always just specifically only focused on energy payloads. They may often have payloads associated with healthcare, government. We've talked about FedRAMP, various certifications that recognize various security best practices within the cloud environment. AI is going to be hard to implement AI without some type of cloud-enabled capability. Then other types of industry, finance, and what have you. So we're going from an environment that is pretty much focused on OT and OT specifically from an energy perspective, now to an environment that might be commingled with other types of critical industries and critical infrastructure. Next slide. So while we're thinking about that commingling, we also need to understand, how are we making this transition? What about the electric power technology stack is unique and different than what you would typically see in a traditional cloud service provider environment? On the left-hand side, as Tim had mentioned, pretty much 95 to 99% of the bulk electric system is on-prem. It's very little low, medium, or high impact assets are being operated consistently in the cloud today. Obviously, we know that is changing. That is not something that we're necessarily saying, hey, is the right thing. That's just a reality. The overwhelming majority is still on-prem. But as we move to the right-hand side with infrastructure and platform as a service, we see software as a service where it appears that it's pretty much completely managed off-prem, at least in terms of responsibility of the stack. But there's a little bit of complexity as it relates to SaaS capabilities or SaaS software as a service functions, where you probably even have two players involved from a cloud perspective. One is the SaaS vendor, who is providing that application for you, but also the infrastructure as a service environment. So you have the vendor that's providing the software and potentially another third party, which is the infrastructure as a service company as well. But if you look to the fifth column that I have on the far right-hand side here, what's unique about electric power is this little thing I call CNC, command and control. So if you look at the application layer, there's typically from an energy perspective, there can be these functions that we layer on top of that or within that bubble. They're associated with supervisory control and data acquisition systems, our core transmission infrastructure, our core generation infrastructure, the ability to perform real-time functions that have a unique element to them that may not always be something that your average cloud service provider or whoever your off-prem partner may be addressing. But also there's another element at the bottom end that makes our environments unique, our OT environments unique, which is their ability to impact and operate from a real-time perspective, hard assets. So we are talking about the ability to integrate and interface with the systems that we need to be able to respond to, in some cases, sub-millisecond activities that are associated with our transmission and generation system. So those are some unique aspects that I want you to start thinking about, is that when we think about command and control, what does that mean both from the asset owner perspective, but also the cloud service provider. Next slide. So the compliance dilemma, as we have anticipated, there are a number of challenges with leveraging SIP and SIP applicable assets into CSPs. But before we really roll our sleeves up into those particular challenges, and we'll go through quite a few in my discussion with you, I also want to recognize that there's several ways that we can potentially go about as an industry resolving this issue. I don't want to assume that before we get into these issues that there's just one size fits all, which we just have to go in and fix all the SIP standards to make them cloud enabled, or at least have the flexibility to utilize cloud in the manner in which an asset owner expects to use them. That is not necessarily what I'm advocating for. I'm recognizing that as an option. It's actually the green option in the lower left-hand corner of this particular slide. But there's other things that we can consider as well. So I'll start with the top left, which is modify existing compliance, monitoring, and enforcement program activities. Right now, there's minimal guidance provided by the ERO at this point in terms of how it would address cloud-based systems if they were to see it in the wild, whether you're using a managed security provider, a cloud-based system for a low-impact system. There's not a tremendous amount of clarity around that. However, there could be some activities that could support that clarification. It could be around the function of registration, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Something called a coordinated functional registration that we will hear a little bit later in the presentation, which provides more delineation and clarification between the roles and responsibilities between entities that are using or leveraging the same asset, which in this case, if we're talking about cloud, we're typically talking about shared assets or shared data center assets. But it may not necessarily require a clear, unambiguous change to the SIP standards. The other option could be maybe updating the SCRM standards, the supply chain risk management particular standards, where we're recognizing the CSP and treating the CSP as a type of supplier, where there could be a vetting process that goes into play to recognize the type of security controls that the cloud service provider meets, whether or not they meet many of the security controls associated with the SIP standards, or it could be acknowledging other types of industry certifications and best practices so that you can potentially leverage a third party independent validation of those controls of a cloud service provider in a way that's consistent with how you manage your supply chain risk management processes and procedures. So I'm not saying, hey, that's the end all be all. Neither am I saying the end all be all of CMEP practices, but that's an option too, is to maybe treat the cloud service providers as another form of a third party and manage that risk, mitigate the compliance risk potentially through the combination of supply chain risk management processes. Change the SIP standards. There's a number of activities associated with that. Fully familiar with the standard drafting team that's currently in place, that's developing the scoping language, the SAR, around what modifications could be made to the SIP standards to allow for more effective adoption of cloud operations from a SIP perspective. But there are some challenges there. Changing the SIP standards takes a while. And when we recognize that one of the precursors to addressing cloud technology several years ago, which was virtualization, I think we identified that as an issue from an industry perspective a little bit over a decade ago. It took roughly 8 to 9 years to get that particular standard and those number of requirements that require changes across the finish line, and we're still have some work to do with getting those fully finalized. So this is not an area that I think industry can afford to take 8 to 10 years to see final changes. And I'm not saying it's ultimately going to take that long, but there's a number of nuanced issues when you really open up the hood and look at the details of SIP operations in the cloud, SIP applicable assets in the cloud. That we really need to make sure that we address, because it's not going to be, again, a one-size-fits-all rule change that may allow for a more effective use. And then lastly, the bottom right-hand corner, an option I haven't heard this talked about too terribly much, which is maybe we need to update our rule of procedure, which is a little similar to this change in our compliance monitoring and enforcement program. But the rule of procedure would potentially recognize those data center operators, i.e. a cloud service provider, as a new type of registered entity, and then the SIP standards would just attach. And not only the SIP standards, but the other reliability standards may potentially attach to those organizations that have a direct ability to impact the reliable operations of the grid. So that's kind of sort of the Rubik's Cube of the various challenges that we have from a compliance perspective. Not saying any one particular solution is the best, but I just want to kind of throw these out there for industry to start thinking about these things when there's opportunity to get in front of NERC and the regions, and maybe even the standard drafting team to start articulating potentially some of their ideas in these 4 lanes.
Hey, Tobias, I just want to add a comment before you move on. For those attending this, that first I'm going to say maybe you're new to the electric sector, or maybe you're involved with CIP for many years, but you're focused on, I do CIP 5, I do CIP 10, I do CIP whatever. And if you look across this slide is gold from a perspective of, I think Tobias probably could have just had this slide up as a background and covered the 45 minutes talking through each one of these things, depending on how long you've been in this space. If you look at 2 elements of this, kind of the update, the supply chain risk management standards, or the change the CIP standards, both of those sort of operate in the model that we have of who are our registered entities, how can we function, what are the current NERC rules of procedure, and then we are an industry where our standards are developed from the entities for the entities. So those organizations that will be impacted the greatest by the standards requirements, they, under the current model, draft them, create the language, submit them, respond to comments, ballot on them, vote them in, and then they have to go do them. And they are very, very kind of aggressive set of standards from a cybersecurity perspective that apply equally to IT and OT. So that's why the standards development process, you may have one asset owner that is a control center only. So they're used to kind of 4 walls and a whole bunch of traditional looking IT assets. They don't own substations or transmission line or power generation assets. So their focus and perspective may be on control center operations. You may have another entity that steps in and says, we're only generation, and they're traditional thermal plants. Or you have another entity that is only generation, but they're all renewables spread out all over the place. So they have different perspectives. You may have others that are transmission only, and then ultimately companies like where I came from, where we were all of it, over a kind of a set control area. So all of those different perspectives and needs and security risks and reliability and resilience in standards development, that is all accounted for. And then it goes through balloting and voting and how are we going to secure and ensure a resilient, safe system. Those processes can take a very long time. If it's a FERC-directed change, they can happen within a year. And then the standard goes through the rest of the process and then implementation, which overall from beginning to end could be a 3-year process. When it's industry asked for, like we need standards to address virtualization, we've seen those take 6, 8 years. And then we've seen after that, we still have to go through all the approvals and then the adoption. So even that virtualization effort that is at an 8-year mark now, we may still have another year, 2-year, 3-year before it's actually in effect. And it's how we're operating. That is the discussion that Tobias was covering in this slide of, if that's the trajectory from a cloud perspective, 8 to 11 years from now, what we're talking about today in regards to cloud, it's not going to be applicable. So things will have moved, things will have changed, how we do it, the concerns will have shifted. We're getting into an innovation and technology model where we need to move quicker. And people have been in this space for a couple of decades like Tobias and have been working with asset owners, have been doing the IT and the OT and the cybersecurity and engineering side, and they've been with the regulators. They're looking for these other 2 models, the CMEP and rules of what can be done from a governance perspective, not just focusing on the standards piece. I didn't want to leave this slide too soon because it is gold. And I would remind everyone here, if you have questions, go to the Q&A in your Zoom app or in your session. Feel free to post questions there and we will try to get them addressed. With that, Tobias, I'm going to go back on mute and charge ahead.
Right. Thank you for that, Tim. We'll come back to this model, but I wanted to kind of set the stage. It's not necessarily one size fits all set of options for industry, but there are options. And I just wanted to make sure industry stakeholders are aware of the various tools that are in the tool belt to address this cloud adoption issue. Okay, so when we're thinking about cloud considerations for the various types of SIP applicable assets, I think we have to take a structured approach to recognizing the individual risks and the individual compliance considerations for each type of SIP asset. So everything on the left-hand side is really focused on the perspective of the asset owner operator. Everything on the right-hand side in blue is the perspective of the cloud service provider. Okay, so this is a sort of the next few slides you're going to see. We're always going to be talking about these cloud considerations from both perspectives. One of the asset owner operator, on the other side is the cloud service provider. And we also have the various types of SIP assets to consider. Non-BES, DER renewables, electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, microgrids, inverter-based resources. That's kind of beneath that bulk electric system level. Yes, we have the same consideration on the blue side, but what does it mean when I begin to aggregate all these pieces of infrastructure? And all these pieces of infrastructure typically can be managed within the cloud. And how does that impact potentially going from not having an impact as it relates to the SIP standards to now having I have a low impact control center because I am aggregating enough of these resources that I now have an impact to the bulk electric system. I know that's a relatively new concept. Don't take my word for it. Crack open FERC Order 2222 and NERC's response, NERC 901's response, and you'll understand that a little bit better and recognizing how assets that don't have individual facility that has an impact to the bulk electric system can be aggregated together and ultimately through aggregation could have a potential impact. Low impact versus aggregation of lows, different implications for either side of the equation. Medium impact BES cyber systems, that's where we get into ECOMS, PACS, BCSI. What are the compliance considerations for that obviously from a utility perspective, and how those may change if you have a number of various medium impact assets, whether it be aggregation of SCADA systems, aggregation of security capabilities and security monitoring functions, firewalls, et cetera, and aggregation of that data, sensitive data in the cloud. The same thing, same issues for high impact for both perspectives. Next slide, please. So to break it down into something simple, I've put together a few scenarios for us to consider. Let's look at this first one, cloud-based internal network security monitoring. So CIP 15, I don't want to get into huge detail with that because I think that still is waiting for approval. It's not fully an implemented standard, but there was a set of requirements potentially for an ACME utility manager that says, hey, I want to leverage off-prem capabilities for internal network monitoring. For any other industry, that particular request would not bat an eye of any individual within an organization. That makes a ton of sense. A lot of the more prevalent threat management solutions are off-prem. And yes, while you can have an on-prem solution, it's very reasonable to leverage an off-prem network monitoring solution. The IT admin that's working with that manager will say, hey, there's a number of network intrusion detection systems, anomalous-based IDS that we can use that can track modifications and changes in our normal network traffic to be able to tell us that something's going wrong in our network. So the question is, okay, how can I make this particular scenario comply? Well, the CSP in this case, the cloud service provider, and the registered entity would provide documentation consistent with CIP 15. And there's requirements that describe how the monitoring is configured. So that's relatively straightforward. So that can be done. The key thing there is that the CSP and the registered entity have to get together to make sure that everything they put in place for the entities, the registered entities, policies, and procedures have to be on the same page. The entity's internal processes for CIP 15 internal network monitoring can't say one thing and then have the cloud service providers processes for its network monitoring for those same technologies say something completely different. They need to be this exact same documentation, so they have to get together to make sure that they're on the same page, that they're in alignment in terms of their policies and how they manage that infrastructure. The second point here, the CSP would have to demonstrate compliance or support demonstration of compliance for R2 and R3. You don't have to read the standard, but it's really getting at protecting internal network and data. The registered entity would then have to incorporate how the data would be protected based on the CSP's capabilities. So again, there needs to be integration between the in-house utility-based policies and procedures along with what the CSP is providing. So ultimately, what we're saying here, if you want to look at internal network monitoring via an off-prem solution, it can be done. It wouldn't necessarily require today, and from today's perspective, a change to the standards, a change to CMAP, a change to the rule of procedure, or any of those things. But you do have to have quite a bit of coordination between you as the asset owner that's responsible for the CIP standards and how those procedures and processes that these cloud service providers leveraging are ultimately coordinated in your as an asset owner's documentation. There's one note at the bottom of the screen I just wanted to point out to, and this is a little unique with CIP 15 and internal network monitoring, is that the internal network data is not necessarily considered ECMs. There's not a one-to-one relationship between the network monitoring data for CIP 15 and what is associated with your electronic access control monitoring systems, which is a key component of a number of the CIP standards. So while they could be in some cases one and the same network intrusion detection systems that you pointed to previously can perform your internal network monitoring, but the CIP standards aren't specifying that you must designate them as ECMs. Key point there, if you don't designate it as an ECM, if you don't designate the internal network monitoring system as an ECM, it potentially can be better leveraged in the cloud because there's less compliance considerations for doing so. Same thing for BCSI. If you look closely at, again, the verbiage in CIP 15, the standard does not recognize this internal network monitoring data as best cyber system information. You can make a declaration that it is, and it's probably best practice that you would probably consider that this information as BCSI, but it does not necessarily give it that designation. Again, from a compliance perspective, if it doesn't have that designation of a CIP applicable asset, there's greater flexibility that you'll have in leveraging that infrastructure in the cloud. So for this scenario, cloud, you can use it. You can use cloud infrastructure today. Doesn't require significant amount of changes from a regulatory perspective to leverage this type of infrastructure from a CSP's perspective. Next slide. Okay, so similar scenario, cloud-based ECMs management. And I talked a little bit about this in the previous slide when I talked about internal network monitoring. I want to use the cloud service to manage my firewalls, my remote access, my dual factor authentication, my identity management, any of these options. Basically, what that means, a high or a medium impact ECMs in the cloud. How could I do this today? Well, a CFR would be required today, okay? We'll get into that. What is a CFR in a little bit greater detail later in the presentation. The service provider must register. We'll get into that and what that means. But if that were to happen, there's a CFR in place and there's a registration in place with the service provider that's performing these functions as if they're a data center or a security function of the data center, then the ACME, the utility, would not be held responsible for the CSP's non-compliance. We'll come back to that point. If no CFR is in place, coordinated functional registration, how could I comply? In this case, the CSP, the cloud service provider, would have to comply and document with every requirement as defined by its customers, which includes producing evidence RSOLs or evidence request tool data requests. The challenge is with that, if you anticipate that a cloud service provider has a number of customers that they're managing infrastructure for, and they address all these types of technologies in their infrastructure, it'll be extremely difficult for them not only to be able to provide you information that says how they would do it, their policies and procedures, but evidence that is actually being done in every single manner in which that is dictated by the CIP standards. But not only that, it has to be written in the format, in the same structure, in the same process that has been approved by every single one of their registered entity customers. That's really, really challenging for a cloud service provider to be able to do that on a consistent basis. So we're typically saying that's almost next to impossible to be managed in a broad sense, in a broad scale from an MSSP or CSP's perspective. Could you do it? Yes, but again, the information, the compliance evidence would have to be maintained in a manner that is unprecedented from a CSP's perspective. And then the registered entity, again, the other risk is if the cloud service provider, for whatever reason, forgot to document the firewall management change of access controls. Just give you an example, there wasn't enough documentation that was clearly justifying what had changed in that ECMS. That potential area of non-compliance would not necessarily be the responsibility of the cloud service provider, but it would necessarily be potentially a non-compliance for all of their registered entities that are dependent on that particular cloud service provider to document its firewall changes appropriately. That's the domino effect that we have currently with the CIP standards. Next slide. Managing BCSI in the cloud. This is a little different than what we have with ECM. So if I'm Acme, as a utility manager at Acme, I might want to use cloud services for information and process management, change management, configuration management. I want to put my SIM in the cloud, patch management and vulnerability management. All of these systems, well, the reason I'm calling out these systems, because I think it's easier to kind of think about these types of concepts with realistic world applications that we're using, but all these systems contain high and medium impact BCSI potentially. Okay, how could I do this? You have to do a CFR. If you had a CFR in place and that the registered the cloud service provider were to register, then Acme would not be held responsible for the CSP's non-compliance. If the CSP does not choose to be a registered entity and be held accountable to the CIP standards independently of the registered entity themselves that they're working for, there are a couple of options to be considered here. Similar to ECMS, the CSP would have to comply and document with every single BCSI policy and procedure associated with every single customer that they're housing BCSI for. Okay. So it can't just be, hey, as a cloud service provider, you just can't provide a blanket statement of this is how we're going to manage your data securely in the cloud. It has to be consistent with every single one of your customers' policy, which means how do you provide access to those individuals that have access to the data? What did they go through the background checks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's required for BCSI. Okay. Again, if there is a mistake at the cloud service provider level, that mistake permeates through every single one of the registered entity customers that they're using, potentially that BCSI solution, which therefore could expose each and every single one of the registered entities to security issues, but also NERC regulatory fines and things of that nature. So that, again, this is why this is challenging, not impossible. I can talk on the next slide a little bit about what makes this potentially a little bit more practical today. Next slide. So simple rule of thumb for BCSI. Current rules for BCSI allows for BCSI to be stored in the cloud so long as the cloud provider cannot access the content of the data. Okay? The cloud provider cannot access the content of the data. The asset owner must not share the decryption key with the vendor. So if I'm saying it that way, we're basically saying the cloud service provider can utilize BCSI so long as they don't have the ability to read the sensitive information or access the sensitive information itself. If they don't have the keys to decrypt, to then understand what the content is of the data, then sure, we can leverage the cloud for that. So right now, the use case for BCSI in the cloud is data storage, data backup, data recovery processes, but not necessarily giving them access to the BCSI itself so that they can take action based on the content of the data. If they take action on the, or read the data or take action on the content of the data, they must be treated no differently than how you would treat your internal employees that have to comply with the BCSI portions of the standard. Okay, next slide. So scenario 3, cloud-based BES cyber systems. Which the challenge here is, potentially Acme utility manager says, I want to use, cloud resources to leverage my fleet of renewable generation. And I want to be able to handle system maintenance and the SCADA portions. I want the vendor or the cloud service provider to do that. Now, I didn't have a slip of the tongue when I said vendor or cloud service provider to perform those functions. In some cases, an OEM can provide hosted SCADA off-prem services for their vendors. Now, this is that SaaS model that I was talking about a little bit earlier in my presentation. And that's that vendor could also have a third party cloud service provider host the infrastructure component. So you have a SaaS EMS plus a public a cloud service managing this off-prem renewable generation DCS, if you will. So you'll see the types of technology which we're talking about here: HMIs, remote access controllers, et cetera. So what's the challenge here? Well, how can I do this today in a compliant manner? CFR, I've mentioned, I'll get to that. Trust me, I will. But if there's no CFR in place, the CSP, again, if it's low, medium, or high, would have to demonstrate compliance to every single requirement of every single standard associated with the high impact, medium impact, or low impact bad cyber system that we have for CIP. Again, that multiplies for the number of customers that they have, and it multiplies for the number of bad cyber systems that they're managing on the behalf of those registered entities. So that's what makes it challenging from a compliance perspective, and there's some unique issues from a security perspective as well. The one point I'm documenting in red, I just want folks to think about this, is that the cloud service provider must is probably too strong of a word, but I'm going to keep it there for now. This cloud service provider must disclose how much generation or transmission it manages in aggregate before accepting any new contracts to manage new bad cyber systems in the cloud. So the scenario that we're getting at here is that you have a off-prem service provider that's providing remote generation management capabilities for your fleet of renewable generation assets. Okay. So in that particular case, what we're saying is that particular cloud service provider must tell you, hey, I'm managing 1,499 megawatts of generation. If I take on your 50 megawatts, I'm going to be at 1,549 megawatts of generation. We know what that means from a CIP perspective for those that have lived in the CIP industry for a long time. That means that you've gone from low to medium. But not only did you go from low to medium from the cloud service provider's perspective, you also now went from a situation that you went from maybe none to low to even, you went from low to medium for the utility. In other words, now that I have a remote access connection from a site that was previously not even on the NERC register or even was just a low impact facility, I now have high water marked up to the medium impact facility if I have a dedicated connection. So the risk works both ways in this case. That yes, there is increased risk, increased compliance risk for the cloud service provider, but also there's still obligations for their partners, the registered entities that are also working with them, to be aware of the aggregate risk associated with leveraging their systems into that environment. Because now you potentially have a dedicated pivot point between something that is higher risk of criticality to an area that's lower risk of criticality. We've always known what to do that within the CIP standards, especially within most traditional utilities, but now we're adding this added dynamic of a third party entity. So I'm gonna leave it there. Those are the challenges as it relates to the various scenarios, low, medium, high, plus the consideration of ECMS, BCSI, as well as low bad cyber systems in the cloud, all of which have unique challenges. The devil's in the detail. Not everyone, are we really addressing the exact same way? There's some similarities, but there is some light potentially at the end of the tunnel. And this is where I'm gonna get into the next slide, please. So I said I was going to come back to this point. I mentioned it probably 15 times by now. So what really is a coordinated functional registration? What is a CFR? Well, a CFR is an arrangement between multiple entities to clearly identify compliance responsibilities. CFR submission must include a written agreement that governs itself and clearly specifies the entity's respective compliance responsibilities for requirements or requirement parts of a selected reliability standards pertaining to a specific function. So what we're saying here is that we've always had within the NERC construct a process to recognize when two distinct entities have shared compliance responsibilities over a bulk electric system grid asset. We've always had this capability. It's called a CFR. So when two generation owner facilities registered as GOs potentially want to use the same generation operator facility, same data center, for their generation fleet, they could require the generation operator to develop a written coordinated function of registration that says this is what the operator will do with this generation owner in combination with the CIP standards, and this is what this generation operator would do with the other generation owner. And have that agreement ultimately approved by NERC and the regions before they formally execute that contract. So that if there was a failure of the generation operator in terms of meeting the CIP standards or any other reliability standard, that failure of meeting the standards wouldn't cascade to every single one of the generation owner environments that they may have relationships with. That may sound a lot like how we could maybe, I don't know, go after this cloud issue. So next slide, let me give you some more examples here. So as I mentioned with the CFR, you can choose the level of shared responsibility. You can say, for my data center function, which is where most of my CIP standards are applied for my generation function or my transmission function, those CIP related standards can be fully or partially the responsibility of another registered entity. In some cases, this will require, in pretty much every case of the CFR, I want to be clear, every case, the two entities involved in this agreement must be considered registered entities. Next slide, please. So application of CSPs, MSSPs, and other solution providers. So to go in more detail, if the registered entity on the left-hand side has a need to leverage their infrastructure into the cloud service provider could, in this case, register with NERC and then sign a CFR in coordination with their registered entity. And as that CFR is approved by NERC and the regions, once that is approved by NERC and the region, then they can formalize their business contract with that registered entity. And any failure that the registered entity has as in terms of meeting their compliance obligations will be the responsibility of the registered entity and of the cloud service provider registered entity. They're both registered entities now. So what we're ultimately saying is that there can be a segregation and delineation of duties between traditional registered entities and their cloud service provider partners. And it's not necessarily just based on, hey, this is potentially a cool way that we can leverage the standards. Let me go one more slide here. Next. The Energy Policy Act of 2005, Section 215, and this is the originating law that gave FERC and NERC their jurisdiction over everything on the bulk electric system, grants the commission to have jurisdiction over all users, owners, and operators. A data center that is used to manage the real-time operations of the grid is very much an operator, whether there's a human physically in the data center and or control center or not. If we ever utilize AI to help us make decisions, yes, I know we always want to have humans in the loop, but say if we had an AI capability to help us be able to make more effective decisions from a real-time perspective, there's no doubt about the fact that the AI would be considered performing a support function of the operator, and whatever systems, tools, and technologies that support that would have to be brought into the jurisdiction of NERC. I think that's pretty much clear. I think that's ultimately the point I'm making here, which is that we want to make sure that industry has an ability to recognize these functions, even though they might not typically be quote unquote a traditional utility that should go about the registration process. There is a new set of energy entrants that are joining this sector, which are, as Tim had mentioned early on, organizations that manage maybe nothing but DERMS or DER, distributed energy resources, maybe large auto manufacturers that have the ability to impact how vehicles are charged or discharged with vehicle to grid capabilities. Those are all little miniature generation facilities that, I've had one auto manufacturer was trying to manage over 5 gigawatts of electric vehicle charging infrastructure within one interconnect. That will undoubtedly obviously have an impact to the bulk system. And should they register? How would they go about registering for that? I'm just saying these are just options for industry to consider. So I know there's just a few minutes left. One more slide, please, Tim, I think. I'll just wrap up with a few things here as it relates to the conclusion. Given the direction of FERC and NERC, there's a recognition that certain entities may have direct impact to the reliable operation of the BES that are not currently registered today due to aggregation. Again, check out FERC Order 2222 and NERC's response and NERC's 901 response to that. There is an EORO approved procedure for recognizing shared responsibilities. Cloud looks like it has a lot of similarities to the construct associated with coordinated functional registration. If there's cloud service providers that are willing to volunteer, I know a few. It's not only just cloud service providers, it would even be off-prem OEMs that have the ability to perform remote SCADA services for their customers. And then lastly, CSPs, MSSPs, and other off-prem operators can utilize the CFR to hold harmless their customers for compliance risks. And I think this is the key piece, because if you listen to some of the other scenarios I talked about, there's a huge domino effect that comes into play if the CSP misoperates or does not manage the compliance obligations correctly. It would impact directly the ability for their customers to demonstrate compliance, and they will be held responsible for that. Next slide. Okay, so I'll leave it there. I think I touched on these points. I know there's a few questions that came up in the chat. More than happy to address the few questions that we have with in the remaining 2 to 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, sir. So I'm going to move us to, here's some information on Tobias for those of you who are interested in reaching out and contacting him directly. I'll make some comments here. So we get all the normal questions that come through, meaning the slide deck will be available. This will be saved off as a PDF. As those who registered through the SANS webinar link, it'll be posted there, as all previous webinars are as well. So the recording session and the PDF of the slides that were covered are available for each one of these. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the first webinar was really hearing from Lou Folkerth and from Chris Holmquist, sort of in regards to why the CTAG was created and sort of what issues they're seeing across the regions and across various entities and why this was needed. As we move to kind of the second one, we really wanted to get the voice of the industry first. So hearing from asset owners and operators, electric utilities, all with unique perspectives. Some of them coming and talking from the perspective of primary control center operations from an independent system operator view. Then hearing from generator owners and operators, and kind of all of those things being captured across webinar 2. So as you look at your own seat and you hear the words coming out of my mouth, and you kind of identify with, I would like to hear this perspective or that perspective. Each one of these webinars, as we move into webinar 3, hearing from the people who provide software and applications in the space. And the last webinar we had was representatives from AWS and from Azure, kind of talking from the cloud service provider perspective, which was great. And now, of course, each one of those recorded, each one of those available, all of the slides available in those sessions. The piece, as you're watching the recorded session, you don't have the opportunity to sort of have professor hours and ask the presenter. So we've been capturing any of the questions that came up in those previous sessions, and we hope to kind of take all those, regardless of how we responded during the session or not, really take that and bring it back to the CTAG and say, here's all the questions that came up. Here's the answers we provided. Are there additional resources or web links or anything that we want to add to this? Create sort of that as a PDF resource document that when all 6 of these are done, you will see kind of all the Q&A that came up throughout the series and links and resources and possible free training wherever it is. We're trying to get to a point where we have a landing page for this. We have one webinar left, which will move into kind of the how do we move forward from where we are right now. We've talked the challenges, we've talked the different paths, but right now, today, entities are going through audits. Right now, today, entities are trying to run programs. And you have groups of individuals that are responsible for NERC and for CIP within an organization, and they may have a CISO or the other part of their org that is saying, we've moved to cloud in this way and we've added and achieved these security capabilities. Why can't we do it for yours? Or if we're low only, what's the challenge? Or we're not a NERC registered entity, what's the problem? So kind of looking across what we've covered in these previous 5, but then also talking in the 6th and hearing this is what's happening right now. This is how entities are able to move forward. This is the realities facing not just the asset owners and operators, but the NERC regions and NERC as the ERO and FERC from the perspective of this is what we're seeing and facing as we go out and conduct audits and conduct enforcement and work with our partners in this space. So that's the collection of the 6. Tobias, I saw a couple of hands come up and asked if they could sort of ask in chat, because I know if you're in a full-blown desktop install of Zoom, you can click more and you can get to the QA. If you're on your phone or if you're on kind of the web browser version, I think getting to the Q&A might be different. So I will just sort of frame a topic here as we're nearly out of time, but I think I'll provide some comments and then I open it to you. For many, the concept of a CFR or a JRO may be something that's foreign. And to think about how it's been used across industry in the past, as we used to be traditional fixed kind of monopoly, vertically integrated utilities, we handled the generation, the transmission, the distribution, the control center operation, and any interchange values. It was all within a fixed operator. Over time in the 90s, NERC sort of established this functional model of who does what, where you would register as, I'm only a generator owner or a generator operator, or, oh, I also do transmission operations and own transmission line, or I'm a reliability coordinator or balancing authority. They were traditionally aligned with electric system functions. And then as new operating models where we would get independent system operators and transmission only and you started to have areas of overlap that would require these CFR agreements that Tobias talked quite a bit about. And then when entities would come in and audit us, they would say, do you have any existing CFRs or JROs? And we would say, sure. And then they would identify what tasks is this other entity obligated to perform so that they could focus our audit on all the things we're required to do. And then the things that go to another party, they would go audit them on for us and for other people that they provided those services. This concept of doing that from a cyber CFR perspective is very unique. It absolutely allows for some accommodation of NERC, and as the ERO could maybe pursue this as adding new functions, maybe pursue this as adding new capabilities for a CFR, and it wouldn't require standards changes. So all of that could be opened and could be pursued in very fast ways. But then the question comes, will it work? Meaning, will a cloud service provider step into that role and say, sure, we'll register as that function and send the auditors to us? And that we can't speak on behalf of the cloud service providers and say they'll do it or they won't. If there's a market, if there's a business, if there's a mission there are many organizations that may say, let's do it. We're already doing this for other government organizations. We're already obligated to do demonstrations of capabilities for other parts of our business. Why is this any different? So there's a potential there. However, and this is Tobias, I would like kind of your opinion on this. There are many that would step in and say, a cloud service provider is never going to do that. And there are others that would say, well, I mean, there's some that might go build a business that's specific for local cloud or community cloud, and they uniquely do this for CIP. So there are some areas where this may have a path. There's some areas where it may not. Tobias, I give you the mic to see if you have anything you would like to add or say. What is the likelihood of this being? I can say it's viable. It exists. It's all possible. What is your thoughts on whether it would be pursued?
Yeah, so that answer really comes down to what you had talked about. You know, there is a business need for leveraging cloud infrastructure today, especially by many of our asset owners. The question comes into play is whether or not a cloud service provider would be willing to volunteer for this additional compliance scrutiny, right? In some cases, some CSPs, I wouldn't even say a CSP, some off-prem solution providers, because I want to throw some of the OEM vendors in this space as well. They've had the ability and have the capability of providing some of these off-prem OT-based services for quite some time. But it's just a matter of whether or not they see a business justification for doing so, whether or not they can demonstrate effectively compliance to the CIP standards. But I also think there is an upside to this that may have been underestimated by maybe some of those CSPs or off-prem service providers, which is if you do create a community or an environment that is specific to this workload, that being that of the electric power system, what could be the potential upside for that? And I think there's more conversation there, but that really comes down to the business choice that these off-prem service providers, cloud service providers are willing to make, and then how they communicate that to their customers.
Wonderful. Tobias, I would like to thank you for your time, for your effort, your years of experience in this space, and sharing this hour with us. For all of our attendees, thank you again. And for those listening in a recorded session, if you have questions, roll back a slide or two and you will see Tobias's contact info. Absolutely feel free to reach out to myself, and anything that either Tobias or I receive, we will bring back to the CTAG and try to capture in kind of that overall Q&A document. We have one more of these left. That will be, I'm moving over to a calendar. I believe, yes, it is scheduled for December 4th, and that will be same time, same channel, same everything. This session will appear as recorded and can be accessed offline. And then you will see the register now for the December 4th session. And we are hoping to hear many different voices from a few different regions across the NERC footprint here in this closing webinar 6. Thank you again for attending. We are about 5 minutes over, and this is about where I expected we would land on this topic. So thanks again for hanging in there, and thanks again, Tobias and Lou and Chris, for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.